teaching practice, pose purposeful questions. And we can see this teaching practice situated inside our box in the framework for facilitate meaningful mathematical discourse, because this practice is really one of the critical pieces that we use as we work to facilitate that strong discourse in our classrooms. So just a brief quote from Taking Action for you to get us started. I'll give you a moment to read it as you consider kind of why is this questioning piece so important. So as we think about questioning, we're going to first explore a few questioning patterns that we see happening very frequently in classrooms. The first pattern we're going to look at is called initiate, response, evaluate, or you'll often hear it referred to as IRE. And in fact, you'll probably see that in your quiz. So just know that IRE stands for initiate, response, evaluate. And this is a really common questioning pattern that we see in lots of mathematics classrooms. So within this pattern, we see a teacher asking a question to gather information, typically with a particular information in mind, or answer in mind. So something like, what does 7 plus 8 equal? A student raises their hand and responds, and the teacher evaluates that response. Is it correct? Is it not correct? Within this pattern, it's not uncommon for teachers to allow less than 5 seconds to respond. One of the ways that we do this is when we ask that question, like what is 7 plus 8, and a hand shoots up, we call on that student immediately rather than giving wait time. And as we talked about in our discourse module, we know that when we do that, the rest of the class stops thinking. So very few students end up with that opportunity to really think about the mathematics. And then lastly, in this pattern, we also see that we don't get access to whether or how students are making sense of the mathematics. So we might know that one student knows the answer to 7 plus 8, but we don't really know how they thought about it or if they actually understand what it means to combine 7 and 8. Another pattern that we frequently see is called a funneling pattern. So within this pattern, a teacher uses a set of questions to lead students to a desired procedure or conclusion. So we start kind of with one that leads to another and then to another. But there's limited attention given to student responses that might deviate from where the teacher is intending to go. So while the teacher might kind of be asking more questions, if a student starts to go in another direction, even if it's mathematically valid or even potentially good thinking for the class, the teacher still steers them down the path they want to go. And within this, students don't get to make their own connections or build their own understandings because everything is oriented towards going down that teacher's planned path. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have a path that you're trying to support, but really thinking about how is our questioning supporting students in building an understanding versus getting to our end goal. And the funneling pattern we see is pretty similar to IRE, but it might have some higher level questions. And then lastly, we see something called a focusing pattern. In a focusing pattern, the teacher attends to what students are thinking and presses them to communicate their thoughts clearly. So we might ask, what does 7 plus 8 equal? But then we're going to ask them, how do they know? How might you prove it? What else can you connect this to? Students are asked to reflect on their own thoughts and those of their classmates. You might be connecting that a little bit to your standard for mathematical practice 3, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. And the teacher is open to a task being investigated in multiple ways. So they might say, okay, I do have this plan that we're going to be really thinking about how the commutative property works. But as a student sees something else that's mathematically valid or important, maybe we'll take some time to be responsive to how that student perceived the task. And another brief quote for you as we kind of think about the focusing questioning pattern and what it may do for our students. I'll give you a moment to read that. I want you to consider what your type of questioning pattern does in terms of its impact on students' mathematical identity and agency as mathematical doers, knowers, and sense makers. How do these different questioning patterns lead students to perceive themselves as mathematicians and mathematics as a subject? So these were 3 questioning patterns. NCTM within Principles to Action has also identified for us different types of questions themselves. And all of these questions might be used at different times for different purposes. They don't explicitly just fit into one of the patterns, but overall, if you're using these 4 types, they could help support you in working towards that focusing pattern. So our 4 types of questions are gathering information, probing thinking, making the mathematics visible, and encouraging reflection and justification. Just a quick note that a question can have more than one purpose at the same time. Its purpose might vary depending on the context that you're asking it in, or even the specific student that you're asking it to within that context. So on this slide, we have a little bit more of a description of each question type, as well as an example for you of each question type. So gathering information, our first question type, when we're thinking about that, that's really a situation where we're asking students to recall facts, definitions, or procedures. It's not automatically low level though. As you look at our example, it says, when you write an equation, what does the equal sign tell you? You all hopefully know this from doing your interviews, that this actually can be an important question that is giving you key information to what a student is thinking. So don't assume that gathering information is only fitting within that IRE questioning pattern. We absolutely have to gather information even within a focusing pattern. And then next we have probing thinking. So within probing thinking, the student's going to end up explaining, elaborating, or clarifying their thinking, maybe even articulating the steps and solution methods or the completion of a task. So what did you do here? Can you tell me how you thought about that? Or our example question, as you drew that number line, what decisions did you make so that you could represent 7/4 on it? And then making the mathematics visible. Students discuss mathematical structures and make connections among mathematical ideas and relationships. An example of a question here might be, what does your equation have to do with the band concert situation? Hopefully you remember that task from before, where the students were setting up the chairs for the concert. So really helping students connect to underlying mathematical ideas. And then lastly, encouraging reflection and justification. And here, students really reveal deeper understanding of their reasoning and actions, and potentially including making an argument for the validity of their work, that justification piece. How might you prove that 51 is the answer? So these ones where they're really taking it to that next level. NCTM also helps us think about these question types within kind of 2 larger archetypes. So we can see gathering information and probing thinking fitting within something they call assessing questions. We're going to explore this a little bit more in the next slide. And then we see making the math visible and encouraging reflection and justification fitting into what they call advancing questions. So we have assessing and advancing questions. Assessing questions are based closely on the student's current work and approach. So we're looking at what they're doing, or we've maybe found out a little bit about what they're saying by listening to them talk to their partner. And these questions are going to clarify aspects of student work and what the student understands. And then they provide information to us as the facilitator of their learning about the student's math understanding. So what are they understanding, or maybe what misconceptions or gaps do they have right now? And for these questions, the teacher is going to stay and hear the answer to the question, right? You're trying to find out what they understand, so you need to know what they actually say. In advancing questions, the teacher is going to use the student work still, but they're going to use it as a basis for moving toward the goal of the lesson or even beyond it. So they're not just kind of finding out what the student's thinking. They're saying, okay, here's a question that can push you farther. They're going to press students to extend what they know to a new situation or a new idea even, and they're going to prompt students to think further about a mathematical idea that they may not yet be currently considering. So, have you thought about how this connects with such and such? In advancing questions, there's a little bit of a change from assessing questions, and that the teacher doesn't necessarily stay to hear the answer, because these questions are not about finding out what the student understands right now. They're about getting the student to think more or think farther, go deeper. And so for advancing questions, we see the teacher will often walk away, in essence creating a pause and allow the student or students to figure out how to proceed. We haven't been physically in the classroom this year, so you might not have examples of this in your mind, but when we are are physically in the classroom, you would see Deanna and I doing this as well. And in fact, when I've taught this in the past, my students are always like, oh, that's why you're walking away. It drives us nuts. But yeah, we get it now. So you might be saying, okay, that's all well and good, but how does a teacher know what questions to ask? And it isn't easy. Questioning is an art, and it is something you have to craft over years of intentional practice. There are some simple steps you can take to get started, though. First and foremost, you need to carefully plan and think about many of the questions that you will ask prior to teaching the lesson. So of course you're going to think of some questions on the fly, but the more purposeful questions that you can think of ahead of time, especially those advancing questions because they're extra hard to craft, the more prepared you will be to ask those purposeful questions to advance your student thinking. General plans can help you get started. You know, those broader things that work in most situations, like how did you think about this? Or is there another way that you could represent this? Or how does your answer compare with your partner's? That can help you get started. But from there, you want to also make sure you're considering the specific mathematics you want students to focus on in that particular lesson or task, as well as their possible entry points. So really thinking about, do I want to surface the distributive property here? What questions might help a student to start thinking about the distributive property? As you think about entry points, really thinking about, okay, where's a place a student might get stuck? And what question could I ask them that I've planned ahead of time that will help them get unstuck without being too leading? Note that NCTM calls for us to ask questions that both assess and advance students' thinking, as we saw on the previous slide. And so we really want to be thinking in advance about both of those questions. In my experience, for myself and what I've seen working with pre-service and in-service teachers, crafting those assessing questions is a lot easier, but those advancing questions can be so powerful for our students. So a couple of key questions or key messages for you as we think about questions. One, teachers can undermine the intent of their curriculum by funneling student thinking down a particular pathway. So we really want to strive for those focusing patterns. And then two, teachers need to be diligent in their interaction patterns. So if it's pushing away from IRE and funneling towards focusing, so that their questions are focusing and building on students' ideas in order to move students towards deeper understanding of the mathematics. As you connect back to equity, access, and identity, we want you to consider the implications of the questions you ask and who you ask them to on students' agency and identity for themselves as mathematicians and their conceptions of mathematics as a subject. Consider who might be more frequently asked questions that advance their mathematical thinking, and consider what the long-term impacts of question types and patterns are on issues of equity, access, and identity. We have one last rather long quotation for you, but there's so much in it that we liked. And this comes from the grades 6 through 8 Taking Action book. So I'll give you a moment to read that. Pause the slideshow or the PowerPoint if you need to.